Hi there and welcome to this week's lesson. So this is week 2 of my course Develop Your Drawing, and this week we're going to carry on the theme of using watercolour, and I'm going to be looking at how to build up forms using flat washes of colour, and then how you can add texture on over the top. Okay, so this week's lesson is very much inspired by this book, Elements of Drawing, by John Ruskin. So this is a very this is an updated version, and this one had some drawings and notes by Bernard Dunstan, who's a more contemporary sort of artist and art teacher who I've mentioned a few times. It's a great book. It's written in a very old-fashioned sort of way, but it does have some great points in it and some good exercises. So I've borrowed one of the exercises in here, and I've adapted it slightly. So we're going to go through those stages and hopefully all will become clear. Just some of the main points though are, if in my last series of classes I talked about texture and mark making. So one of the things that I said there is texture. What you have to do with texture is you need to understand the underlying form. Okay, so if you're doing something like a cylinder, you need to understand that cylinder, and then your marks can help communicate that three-dimensional form. Well, that's very much what we're doing here. We're sort of trying to build up a more solid sense of form using these flat washes, and then apply marks and smaller marks over the top. One of the problems when people start watercolors is they can tend to start making, they call it, it's a bit like pecky marks. So a small brush dipped in and very small pecking little marks. Now, by themselves, that can make a rather sort of fragmented image, and it sometimes can lack the sort of confidence that you can see in sort of, more professional sort of watercolorists' work. So this approach, you start with the bigger washes, building up the forms, and then you go on to using these smaller sort of pecky strokes over the top to build up texture. So that way you can use both. Okay, now for today's lesson, I'm just going to be working in monochrome for the exercises that I've done, but feel free to play around with that. You could certainly, monochrome's a good place to start with, especially as we're looking up to build up form and three-dimensional sort of mass that way. But certainly, as a look at it as a springboard. If you want to try and incorporate more colors into some of these exercises, then feel free. Anyway, I hope you find it useful, and I say it's a great opportunity to again go a bit deeper into your watercolors. And I say hopefully I'm going to be focusing, my final exercise is going to be using trees, which is a great subject because of the sort of rich texture you get. But you could do all sorts of subjects, old buildings that are broken down, old cars. You could use fruit, walnuts. Walnuts have got that great sort of texture to them. Anything that has a lot of texture would probably lend itself quite well to this exercise. So don't feel you have to do a tree, because that's what I've done. Anyway, so I will get stuck into the exercises for you. Okay, so this first exercise is just creating a simple gradient. So as I said, we're just, this is a monochrome exercise, which, just to clarify, that's just one colour. And really an ideal colour for this is something that's quite dark in tone. So a blue, ivory, black, umber, something like that. But I'm having a go with blue here. And so I've done 2 squares here. You could probably get away with just doing 1, but I did 2 because I wanted to show you the stages sort of separately. So what you do is you get your square and then you mix up some paint, and you're actually looking to create a fairly dilute mixture. So this is going to be our lightest wash. And then what you try and do is you lay in this wash. Okay, you cover the entire square with your first wash, and then I've edited it out, but then what you do is you actually let that dry completely. Okay, so you can either do that with a hairdryer or just go and making a cup of tea or something like that. And then what we're doing is we're progressively adding layers. So this is where watercolour comes into its own. It's a bit like glazing. You could think of it as like you're laying thin, transparent sheets of colour, one over the other. And as you do that, you build up this very rich, dense colour, which is one of the really nice qualities of using watercolour. So each wash needs to be done, you need to get a feel for it, but you need to do it with enough water so that you don't see brush marks within that wash. You see, I tried to apply the washes quite quickly and briskly. So play around with that. I think I could probably have done with making up a bit more paint. You really want to be just using the same density sort of pigment. So the ratio of water to pigment should be about the same. So when you have to dip back into the colours, you're probably going to make it a bit stronger. So as you can see, this builds up this nice, we've done 4 layers there. You can also see when it dries, the whole thing lightens again. So, you know, it's another challenge of watercolours, is taking into account the lightening effect. So there we can see a nice gradient. Now, as I say, this is from the John Ruskin book, Elements of Drawing. And what I'm showing you here is, he says that once you've laid down these discrete bands of colour, you then go in and you can sort of fiddle around with it. And you're basically trying to take the edges off and create a smoother gradient. Okay, this is how he describes it. He says, then with the brush rather dry, try with small touches to add shade delicately beyond each edge, so as to lead the darker tints into the paler ones imperceptibly. By touching the paper very lightly and putting a multitude of little touches, crossing and recrossing in every direction, you will gradually be able to work up to the darker tints outside of each, so as quite to efface their edges and unite them tenderly with the next tint. Okay, so that's what I've had a go at. With sort of fairly mixed results. So when it's dry, it becomes a bit harder to work into. But the idea is you're sort of dipping into your watercolours, picking up little bits of pigment, and you're just trying to smooth out that gradient. So it's got a nice, you know, fades from that light blue at the top to the dark blue at the bottom without those bands. This is the idea of this bit. You're trying to get rid of the bands. And as we see later, this basically sets the template of the exercises I'm going to introduce. So this is the next one. As you can see, this is that nice Archer's watercolour paper that I mentioned in my materials suggestions. That's a watercolour block, so it's sort of it really holds well together even when it's a bit wet. Okay, and this is the subject. So this is the next exercise, which is we're going to do this stone. Okay. So I very lightly sketched in the stone, and then we're going through the same procedure, which is to basically lay down layers of tone. So this is starting with the palest of the tones, okay? And that is a nice flat wash. As you can see at the moment, no brush marks within it. It's a flat wash. That means you can't see individual marks, and that's one of the things I'd really like you to try and concentrate on. Then when that's dry completely, we're just going to repeat the process, add the next level of darks. So this is where squinting your eyes, you might have to think a few steps ahead for this, but I say you're trying to just build it up, slowly build up these layers of dark. And depending on whether you use the hairdryer or not, it does take a little while for this to completely dry, but you won't get the effect if you try and do it all in one go. Everything will just merge into everything else and you won't get these discrete bands of tone. So hopefully you can see what's coming though, is that this approach, this creates our foundation of our tonal values. And it then acts as a base upon which we can put our smaller, more delicate marks. So there we go. I've got my smaller brush out now, and I'm starting to put in these smaller. So this is where we're getting into texture. So you can use a smaller brush. As long as you've got a brush that goes to a point, you will be able to do this. And I found between doing this exercise and the final exercise, you do learn a lot as you go about this particular technique. And one of the things I really picked up on is you really need it to be very dry if you want these little touches. So these are our little tonal sort of our pecking marks. If you want those to sort of stand out, you need to do your best to basically make sure the surface is dry. As soon as it gets damp, it becomes very hard to lay down discrete marks. As you can see, everything starts to blur and sort of fade into each other, which isn't ideal. And as you can see, I'm going back and forth, adding a bit, taking a bit away, using the cloth to remove excess paint. So this would be very hard to do. Say if you started from scratch just with white, you wouldn't have already established that those tonal values underneath. That's where this exercise really comes into its own. So I'm laying a few more darks in there. And again, with the marks and the texture, the idea isn't to sort of slavishly copy each mark. So you can see there, I let the whole thing dry out again before going in and having another go with the marks. Yeah, you're not trying to slavishly copy every little dot. It would be, almost impossible, I think, to sort of, to do that. It would require a great deal of patience. You're trying to get the general feel of the dots, the distribution of the marks, and say you're not looking to make a complete sort of a printer copy of the stone. You're just trying to get the feel for it. So as you can see now, with it completely dry, my little marks are going on much more nicely over the top, and I'm much more in control of how the texture is relating to the underlying drawing. So as I say, when I did my lesson on texture, I was talking about, what we're interested here is variety of marks, and you're just trying to sort of break the form up really, just create interest, and you're trying to trick the eye. That's one of the things. You're just trying to suggest texture, just to give it enough clues that the brain will sort of assume, oh, okay, that's stone, that's wood, and such and such. So there we go. And again, I could have done a few more passes on this, but I just tried to bring the thing to a conclusion. So there's the stone. So yeah, find a nice stone for that. It's very important when you take your reference photo, get it nicely set up by a window so you've got strong lighting. That will make life a lot easier for you when you come to do this exercise. And just dipping in a few more dark. You can see it's becoming a bit wetter now, so there is diffusion happening. That shows you that the surface has become quite wet, which isn't a bad thing, but it's just the more you do this, the more you'll become sensitive to when you've got a bit too much water on, perhaps when you've lost control and you need to let the whole thing dry out again. So that was the stone. Okay, so this was the my sort of main study. So I decided to have a go at a tree. I really, in recent sort of months, I came across an article, I think it was in Artists and Illustrators, about a group of painters called the Arborealists, and they basically take trees as their primary subject and explore them in different ways. Some are realistic, some are abstract, and I read a bit about it. I thought it was really interesting. And of course, one of the great challenges with painting is sometimes, not being exactly sure what to have a go at. Well, you know, if you ever get in that stage, then I would strongly recommend trees are a great subject. Um, there's normally lots of them about, and they all have a distinct sort of characteristic, and provide great challenges and sort of opportunities for artists to sort of explore different ideas. So this is a tree from Christchurch Park in Ipswich, so probably hundreds of years old. And again, I picked it because it has that, you know, it's got the real characteristics of an old tree. I'm going to guess it's an oak tree. I might be wrong. And that really lends itself to this experiment. So what I'm doing with the exercise here is just, you know, same as before. First pass is my lightest lights. Okay, so I'm going to leave white paper as my lightest lights, but I'm putting in my first tone. So again, we're trying to build this up gradually. It takes a lot of patience, but as you can see, it's working as a flat wash at this stage. There are no discrete brush marks visible within the masses. Okay, so you have to work quickly, and if the paper sort of absorbs too quickly, then you will end up with sort of scratchy marks all over the thing. So there it's dried. So now I can go in and repeat the process. So I tried to create a sort of bird's eye view here. So I'm just using burnt umber for this. This is the colour scheme here. So you have to resist the temptation to get into detail too early. And you also have to resist the temptation to start painting into it when it's still wet. And that was where I got caught out a couple of times. But if you let it dry, then these washes will go on nice and discreetly and really create quite a strong, convincing sense of form, which can act as the foundation for your drawing. The other thing about gathering reference for these, so with the stone I had strong lighting. With this tree also, there was, you know, I went out early in the morning to Christchurch Park, so there was a nice sense of light hitting the side of the tree and a bit of a cast shadow going off to the side there. Again, all those things, those visual clues will really help you with your composition and design. And also, when you're applying these initial washes, trying to build the form, it makes sense if you know where the light's coming from, where the shadow's going. Okay. And as we come towards summer, probably the best time to go and get good reference for trees like this will be early in the morning or in the evening. So in the middle of the day, the sun will be up very high and you might not get quite so much modelling on the actual sort of tree trunk itself. So I was in two minds whether to just leave the tree with a completely blank background, but I decided in the end to include the background, as I think it just, you know, it created more interest. So here we are. I think this is the third wash now. As I say, I had quite large breaks between the washes. And that means you come back to it sort of quite fresh, but it requires a certain degree of patience. I find watercolours, certainly with this drying time, and you know, I'm used to painting in oils, really trying to paint things in one go. And so taking this more sort of patient sort of approach is quite different, but I found it a really good, you know, a good exercise. And especially when I get into the texture, it's an opportunity to get more into a subject than you might normally do with painting, where you might be a bit more generalized. Okay, so that I think is, I've now established all the tonal values, and the whole thing's dried out. So now I can go in and do my small marks. This is where I can really get into the texture. And so, as I say, it's important, let it completely dry out, and then you can go in. Again, you're not trying to use watercolour. You don't ever want to be using it like where it's pure watercolour. You don't want it to be opaque. So you're trying to, mix it up with a little bit of water, and hopefully it will still read as discrete marks on your flat washes. So regardless of the subject, this is where when you're putting down the texture, again, thinking about how the form is behaving, where the light's coming from, all of those things will mean that your texture marks won't sort of destroy the form or sort of harm the form. And again, you're trying to strike that balance between sort of generalized mark making just to communicate the surface, but also having a good look, trying to get variety. Variety will make make your work more interesting. So John Ruskin in this book, he has quite a few exercises to do with trees, and I think he felt there's a lot you can learn from studying trees. They have very complex forms, and there's something to do with certainly observing the way the branches behave and those sorts of things, which you won't get it from just sort of learning sort of particular techniques. It helps to actually go out and study them, really have a good look. So as you can see, the little marks I'm making are really sort of sitting quite nicely on top of the underlying tonal values. And that's something I really liked about this exercise. I mean, I have to say I was really pleased with my outcome on this. I say I don't do a lot of, I recently sort of got into doing more watercolours, but it's never been my sort of go-to medium. But I think actually doing this exercise really opened my eyes to some of the possibilities. And I say it is a great bridge between drawing and painting, perhaps in a way that you don't quite get with oils. And certainly this approach I'm doing here with these small, delicate marks, that to me feels more like drawing than I think of painting, like big shapes, simplified forms. So say perhaps once you've done one of these exercises in monochrome, if you wanted to then approach it in colour, that would be, I think, really interesting, because you could then play around with your initial flat washes. You could vary those colours, which again you get those nice glazing effects of one colour sitting over another. But then also introducing colour into your mark making in this stage could also add interest. So say if you didn't have the underlying tonal washers on this, you would easily end up with a bit of a mess. But say that underlying that form that you've established in the early stages, that really helps all the marks to make sense. So you can see in the areas that I left white, I did add marks and just allowed small bits of white to show through. And again here, little marks on the floor. The small marks are basically what's helping to unify the painting. At the end, we shouldn't really even be aware of those large flat washes that we started with. And again, I'm using those side-to-side marks. These are sort of cast shadows by the trees. But they also help, those horizontal lines, they help to suggest background going behind the tree and coming out the other side. So overlapping forms basically. Now I think at this stage, once I'd established the mark making and I do start to play around with some of the washes and just, you know, tidying up the shading as well. There I've taken it, got my small brush and I'm putting branches in. Again, branches I think all go under the category of mark making, icing on the cake basically, that needs to be added towards the end of a painting. And there I'm just suggesting one of the distant trees. So if you have a sort of patient temperament and you sort of like to get into detail on subjects, then you know, I think you'll really enjoy this way of working. Again, a lot of it's about picking out good subjects, good, or I think organic forms work well. In fact, one of the things I like in this Ruskin book, he talks about you know, picking your subjects. He's a big fan of picking things that are sort of old, communicate a sense of time. He didn't like, you know, like a rundown barn, old steps, things that have an aged quality. He was a big fan of this as a subject. And like a tree like this, you know, it's been around for a while. It's got more interest than just one that's like a straight up, like a column. I don't think that would be quite such a good subject, really. Okay, so there we go. I think that's sort of about it. A few sort of finishing touches coming in here, but hopefully you get the general idea. I say the 3 exercises give you a nice progression going from the very simple gradient just to get the hang of the washes and the pecking marks. Then the stone give you, you know, the opportunity to create form, and then taking on a more complex subject like this. So it's a nice way to sort of work into it. I say if you want to take it further with colour, then that would be great. I'm adding a few splashes there to sort of suggest leaves and just add a bit of visual interest. The dark marks push everything else back. So yeah, have a play with that, and you can hand those all in to me. Those of you that complete this as part of my course, you know, hand this in on Thursday and we can see how everyone got on. Anyway, I really hope you found that useful. If you've got any feedback, I'd always like to hear from you in the comments, and remember to like, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll look forward to seeing what you produce, and I'll see you again next Monday for another lesson. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye.